All right, welcome everyone to the Wednesday, August 2nd Istio Combined Work Group meeting. First up, we have Lynn talking to us about injected headers.
All right, yeah, hi everybody. Francis, do you want me sharing or do you want to bring up the doc?
Why don't you go ahead? That way you can actually drive.
Okay, thank you.
The doc, I mean.
All right, let me do that. So I'll take over your control from the main presenter. All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about that. So this is a proposal that was, I guess, was discussed a couple of weeks ago, and I was not able to attend, but I did re-listen to the recording. So one of the item was to kind of write a proposal. I think it was Keith was requesting that because there are a bunch of folks who doesn't familiar with the context of, the injected header. So I've been doing a little bit of background digging just to brief up everybody on injected headers and the issues in Istio. So basically what Istio has right now is we ship a bunch of headers and there are two types of headers in general. From what user reported from different issues on the gateway side, we've got a couple of users wants to remove some of the headers, for example, Envoy upstream service time, and also like the client certs, X-forwarded client certs for egress traffic, and X-forwarded proto, and some of the requests. So I've linked to the issues if you would like to read more on this. One issue I would specifically want to point out, which I've seen so many users asking, is from mesh to external traffic. For instance, if you have sleep pod in the mesh that's calling an external service, we use HTTP as an example, but you can imagine that could be maybe your cloud service, maybe your Lambda service, any type of services that's external to this cluster and mesh. In this case, we send X-Envoy metadata and also X-Envoy peer metadata ID, which is very concerning to many of our users. And it's even raised to the flag of their security team, like you can't really using Istio with these headers when you send these headers to out of mesh services, which it could be out of their control, right? What if the external services take this metadata and be able to, pass some of the interesting information and leverage all that? So I'm giving an example here so you have an idea of what these headers and the value of these headers looks like. And you're welcome to also read this particular issue that has a bunch of users chime in and with their concerns of leaking sensitive info is what the user are really concerned in this case. So that's the background information. The requirement really is, I would say, the sensitive information leaking outside of the mesh. I think that's the number one concern I've seen by reading different issues. Well, it resonates most with people. So users should be able to turn it off or maybe have it disabled by default before they have time to looking into a proper egress control. Because some of the users were saying they have thousands of external service. It's too hard for them to adopt a proper egress control. And this is preventing them even adopt a mesh because of the security concern with the sensitive info leaked. The other thing that needs to keep in mind is we don't want user to remove telemetry headers, right, for intro service mesh communication because these first of all are transparent to the services. So the service itself shouldn't be getting these telemetry headers because Envoy sidecar, do the work to make them transparent, to have the headers added and restricted from source to target. So there shouldn't be any reason user needs to remove these headers for intro service mesh communications. Plus the fact that if they do remove them, they would lose metrics. So we want to make sure we don't provide a way to, have them remove these headers for intro service mesh communications. However, from the mesh to out of the mesh, user does wants to have the sensitive info stripped out. In addition to that, not telemetry metadata related, users should be able to tweak some of the Envoy headers that mentioned earlier. That's not specific to telemetry related, and they should be able to easily apply those to workload or mesh wide if they choose to. So I propose us to kind of categorize the metadata, the headers, into two categories. The first category is the telemetry related configuration. The second category is long telemetry related configuration, because the telemetry related configuration has different characteristics and also have the sensitive information leaked concern from our user, and also plus we don't want user mess up telemetry headers for services communicated within the mesh. So there are potentially a couple of options. Option one for telemetry headers is having this option configurable in the telemetry resource, which does make sense when you first think about it, right? This is telemetry related. Let's have it in the telemetry resource, have it configurable, and telemetry resource today have workload selector, so you could potentially apply it to mesh wide, or you could potentially apply to particular workload by selecting the workload. The challenging though is it could be potentially pretty hard to do if you want to think out all your workloads that's talking to out of mesh services, particularly when you have thousands of external services you're using. So I would say this is not very user-friendly in that case, optional one. And plus, configure it in the telemetry resource, it could be error-prone for intro mesh communication, because we don't want users to remove those headers in intro mesh communications. So I'm not a big fan of option one. Option two, I think Carsten was leaning towards something like a global configuration, which I'm also very leaning towards. I mean, we can discuss on the name. So essentially, there could be a global configuration in mesh config that user can config during installation or afterwards to say, look, I don't want these actual metadata headers for when I talk to out of mesh services. So I think this provides the best user experience if we can do it. The only challenge is I'm not sure, how doable it is. John, go ahead.
Yeah, what is an out-of-mesh service?
That's the key thing, right? So how do you characterize out-of-mesh service who doesn't have capability to process the X-Envoy metadata, which in this case, you would be leaking the sensitive information. Carsten?
Yeah, there is a separate discussion going on about this with plain text traffic. We do technically have a good way to know if someone is in mesh or not, because we have the auto MTLS header, and all the mesh workloads have a sidecar and have the either auto MTLS or HBON metadata. So we do technically have ability to send headers only to mesh workloads and not send it to non-mesh workloads. Completely automatic without any option for the user, actually.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I think that what is
a
mesh workload? Like, it has no meaning.
It has a meaning. I mean, we
can make a meaning, but everyone, if you ask 10 people, you probably get 12 answers today, right?
Well, no, it's only one answer. If it has a sidecar, it's using Istio, and it's a mesh workload, has workload identity, has it's part of the mesh. If it's a doesn't have a sidecar, it's obviously not a mesh workload. It doesn't have identity. It doesn't apply all the rules.
What if it's in a different cluster and you don't know about it, but it happens to actually meet all those criteria?
I mean, you need to do an MTLS handshake and verify the peer identity. So you need to get, the list of species identities. You need to get, it cannot be just a part of the mesh not have identity.
Can we rely on plain text traffic? If it's plain text, would it be safe to say we can strip these telemetry headers?
It is safe to say it's not mesh because it's clearly not using workload identity. It's clearly not, applying mesh policies. So we cannot call it mesh if it's plain text, really.
So are you agreeing with that? I wasn't sure.
No. I'm also arguing in different discussions that mesh policy apply to mesh workloads that have MTLS on both ends and are clearly identified as such, and not to plain text. Not only this, other things as well.
Right. But I'm trying to get back to John's question, right? How do you determine out of mesh, right? In our case, out of mesh could be external services. Out mesh could also be pods in Kubernetes within the single cluster, but just not having sidecar or ambient, right? Lei, we probably should let you go first. I think you have a hand first.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that the goal of this proposal is to filter some sensitive headers in order to not, making a new view for new headers you want to filter. Probably it makes sense to not restrict this to telemetry related configuration, because this seems to be a general requirement from users, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
If it's specific to telemetry, then what if some other field headers the user want to remove is not telemetry? And by the way, this peer metadata also used for security. For example, the TLS related, auto TLS, MTLS related. So basically,
so by the way, maybe I should have finished the proposal before we discuss the implementation, because I'm not proposing that we only handles telemetry headers and nothing else, right? So maybe I should just finish before I get to the hands. So I do agree with John's concern. Implementation, be able to detect out of mesh. I think that's TBD. We need to discuss if it's possible. But option 2 does provide the best experience, in my opinion. Option 3 and also option 2 provides backwards compatible, so user at least it's configurable. Option 3 is basically option 2, but just thinking this is a bug, we can fix it. We can auto detect the out of mesh and strip the header for the user, so user doesn't have to worry about the actual configuration. So the implementation of those, though, I do want to have you guys and Quat weigh in, because I think the implementation backs to what John was saying. How do we detect the out of mesh consistently? So that's the proposal options we have for telemetry X Envoy metadata headers related. And then for the other headers, John has a great proposal about how to do that in proxy config, which you can use proxy config to turn off the headers, which I think it's great. One of the challenging I thought about with that proposal is, what if the user already using Envoy filter or virtual service or service entry to remove these headers? By the way, users have been writing blogs about how to do those. So we know people are using those in production. And if they are already using those, they need to either decide they use the new API or they just remove the old way to do that. And if it happens, they do both. John kind of convinced me, we'll just attempt to remove headers twice, which is not a big deal. It's just not very efficient, but the results should be the same. And option 2 for the other header would just be using mesh config to configure mesh weights. So if the user needs more granular control, they can continue use Envoy filter and virtual service and the resources, service entry resources today. So they do have an approach today. It's not pretty, but a mesh config can provide them a global mesh-wide config. So with that, I would like to, I think, John, you have a hand next.
Yeah, one thing that's kind of been bothering me about the metadata stuff, the peer metadata one specifically, is the use cases that we've been saying is that users don't want to leak information, but then we're trying to just guess based on somewhat arbitrary things whether we send it or not, that don't seem related to whether we trust them with the information. It feels like we're not actually really addressing the problem that users have some need to say, I don't trust this endpoint with my information. Like, why does MTLS mean I trust it to know who my metadata, I guess? Or why does plaintext mean I don't trust it to know who I am?
If you, the question is for me, John, I don't think it's related. I mean, it's not about trust. It's about you are part of the mesh or you are not part of the mesh. I mean, it's if you are not part of the mesh, why would you send you data that is not relevant to mesh?
But the use cases that Lynn was presenting, I believe, was that users think that the data is sensitive and they don't want to leak it to
They don't want to send it out to this destination because their security team say you can't adopt Istio because it's sending all these headers and the value of these headers to outside of the cluster, right? Is there a further question on the user case for this one, or are we cool with that?
I don't get how, like, what are they fine with and what not? Is it cluster? Is it mesh? Is it over TLS? Like, we should decide what the user actually wants and then work backwards.
Yeah, so when I spoke to all the users, they were concerned about these going out of the cluster, right? Going out of, they realize there are problem of pods in the cluster that's not participating in the mesh, but that's less a concern. They're more concerned about we send these headers when they call external services going outside of their cluster.
You said outside. I don't mean to be pedantic here, but I think it's more to get it right. You said outside the cluster, but what about cross-cluster communications in the mesh?
That's a good point. Yeah, because I guess for single cluster would be outside of the cluster, right? For cross when you have multiple cluster, I would assume it's the boundary of the mesh, right? So you would be okay because you need the telemetry metadata in that case if you're just sending across different cluster, but still within the mesh, right? So that doesn't have a concern. The concern is more talking to external services outside of the mesh. Okay, I think Kiss, you have a hand. I'd like to get to you.
Yeah, I think I have a more general question that takes, I think, a little, maybe the opposite approach from what John was saying earlier. Do we have a list of these headers codified as an API anywhere? If we don't, it feels like we probably should because these headers feel like an API. And then following from that, if we have an API where we have a contract where we know where these headers are necessary, why should we send these headers anywhere where it's not necessary? So for me personally, I don't necessarily see this necessarily as a customer ask. It feels more like our API is leaking to places where it shouldn't. So we need to identify where these things are necessary.
That is right.
And not send it where it's not necessary.
That's exactly why I think this is more like a bug in the eyes of the customer because they don't expect these type of X-Envoy metadata for in-mesh to out-of-mesh external services. So they would just rather not see it and deal with it. And to answer your question, Keith, we do have APIs to allow you to remove headers, but they're not as easy to use. You can do Envoy filter, you can do virtual service, and then specify headers. So you have to know what you are doing, basically. And it's harder to also kind of scope it to say, hey, let me create this Envoy filter or virtual service that applies only to the workloads that's calling out of mesh services. So that's almost impossible unless you figure out exactly which ones.
Well, I mean, so you mentioned you've got APIs to remove the headers, but I think, I don't know that users should ever be doing that. Like, this feels so internal to how Istio works.
Yeah.
Users should never be concerned with having to remove these headers. Like, if users
You're right.
these headers, it feels. I'm very much in option 3's camp, where like this is a bug. Like, there should be no public API to remove these things. If it's necessary, it goes there.
I
If
agree with
it's
you.
not there.
Right, I totally agree with you. That's why for telemetry header, I'm leaning towards option 3, so user doesn't have to worry about it. The only thing is, if users are relying on these headers, which I don't think anybody are, people would rather get rid of it. Having a flag at least give them a backwards compatible option. But I really don't know anybody relying on these headers for out-of-mesh communication.
If they're relying on the headers, they're relying on something that's not an API. Therefore, there's no backward compatibility guarantee, in my opinion. So, I'd be fine with a rude awakening here. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of my POV.
Mm-hmm. John.
I think the fact is that if we do this, people will lose telemetry. It's not a question. It's a fact. It will happen. So is it worth it them losing telemetry? And they probably have a dumb config if they're losing telemetry. Like, that's true. They can probably fix it. But we do need to consider that, right? Like, for example, you may have a sidecar resource and you accidentally scoped down too much. So I'm calling HTTP bin, but I don't know anything about it. So I have to assume it's out of the mesh and I don't send the headers. Today you get telemetry. Tomorrow you would not.
Remember,
Maybe
John, I pinned you a couple of days ago. I actually did a test about, not sending Envoy Envoy metadata when I'm calling from sleep inside of the mesh to HTTP being outside of the mesh. So basically, I use Envoy filter to strip out those headers, and I'm still getting metrics, the partial metrics on that side.
I don't think your test was testing what we're talking about, losing metrics.
Okay, can you clarify that for me then?
Yes,
I didn't
the
get
header
the
exchange is so that the other side can understand who you are to report metrics. You don't need them to report your own metrics. So if you're calling HTTP bin, you already only have one-sided metrics and the exchange does nothing. But if I'm calling HTTP bin in the cluster and I don't send the headers to it, then when that side tries to report its destination metrics, it won't know who the source is. So it won't be able to report complete metrics.
Right. So that's,
and when you're trying to report the destination attributes, obviously for an external service, we don't know the destination app or whatever. There is none. But if it's in the cluster, we could.
So HTTP bin will have a sidecar will do SPIFFE and all the other stuff, and we don't know about it. We don't know, how would security work if we don't know the secure names.
If you have like a overly aggressive sidecar, you'd go pass through and do plain text. But if they don't have strict mode, it would accept it and report telemetry just fine, right?
So basically, security is broken.
No, so, like don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is how users should run their cluster, but today they have telemetry, tomorrow they won't. So we need to at least accept that and not pretend that's not the case.
But we're also pretending they have security. That's the problem.
Yes, I get it. I'm not saying it's the wrong.
Why are you arguing for it?
No. Everyone here is saying that there's no telemetry loss, and I want to be clear. There is telemetry loss. That may be acceptable telemetry loss, but let's make sure we actually understand what we're deciding here.
Yeah, that's the value of option 2, right? So if you're on these odd cases, where you may have the metadata that's important, then you can still go back to the old behavior.
Yeah, to me, this should be like, if we're doing that, it's like a feature flag opt-out temporary thing so that you can mitigate. Like, one, a user is not going to know that they're in this case. So they're just, like, I can't fathom a user ever setting this option. Unless, well, sorry, if we default it to not having the headers, then I can't imagine a user like, first they'll just like go and be like, what the hell's wrong? I don't have telemetry, and they'll bang their head against the wall for a week.
Right. I agree.
Maybe eventually
you
they'll
have to
find
opt
it,
in for you have to opt in for this.
But we don't want to have to opt in, right? Because then it's leaky, and everyone will say like, wow, what are all these headers I don't want? So,
well, if you care about it, you opt in, and you know, gradually, maybe one day after a few releases, if it's stable, we can enable it by default.
I guess my main point is we shouldn't treat this as a real API. It's maybe we have a feature flag to turn it off, but it's not a real thing. It's an escape hatch, right, for backwards compatibility.
So that would be something close to option 2 in that case. Would you agree?
Like option 2, yeah, but not for mesh config, like an environment variable, just like other feature flags, temporary.
Okay, I'll add that as a sub option. Any other opinions? Do we have quad? I guess not. Costin, you still have a hand. Yeah.
Oh no, sorry. I think everything was clearly stated. I mean, it's you know, external. You know, if we lose security, the telemetry is the least thing we need to worry. But you also mentioned you want to extend it for security related attributes like Explorer client certificate and other security related. And that's another point where it gets even more stringent, that we do not send these two things that are not part of the mesh. And you know, we had the gateway topology. We have plenty of cases where we leaked headers or we trusted headers or we forward headers that we shouldn't. So basically, I'm all for, you know, if it's not clearly with sidecar and everything, then we should just kill it and make it clear in the docs that is not a supported use case, not pretend.
So what, only MTLS gets the headers? Is that what we're arriving at?
I wouldn't say only MTLS, but only things where we know it has a sidecar and it's Istio. So a sidecar or ambient or something that it's, you know, we control both ends. If we don't control both ends, there is no point to send internal information about mesh to things that are not part of the mesh. gRPC too, by the way.
How we identify that is actually not super trivial, I think.
But we have auto MTLS. We have auto MTLS, which we can. Do we still have users that use Istio with plain text and no sidecar? We can add a similar annotation like auto MTLS.
Add to where? Oh, you ask a user to add it?
No. Like we add OTM. So the use case with TLS is clear. It's already supported. We just need to take advantage of it and use it. If you have a use case where people disable TLS, they have no TLS, but they still run sidecars with some settings to override Istio to not use certificates, that's a case where user will be in the mesh and expect telemetry, but there is not auto MTLS. So auto MTLS solution doesn't work. So we can do exactly the same thing, add an extra label on the sidecar to indicate that the workload is part of the mesh, but is not using MTLS. So a third case, we have the case with HBone, we have the case with traditional auto MTLS, will be another case for the weird situation where certificates are not used, but telemetry and routing are used. I don't know how important it is.
Lee, do you want to go next?
Yes. So basically, the metadata is partially used for determining whether the other end is Istio sidecar, right? So if we want to implement a logic that only if the other end is Istio sidecar and the channel is protected by Istio MTLS, then we allow to send these headers. Then we need some kind of other header, a new header, right? Because otherwise, it's chicken and egg, right? So first you need to get the metadata in order to determine the other hand is Istio sidecar. So what I mean is we need to introduce a new header if that is the determined direction to go. Essentially, you send a header, say, I'm Istio sidecar. Then we begin to exchange this, construct the MTLS channel and exchange the mesh headers.
Lei, can you clarify what we use the header for to say that we're Istio? I'm not aware of this functionality.
Yeah, so in the meta, so basically the auto MTLS, right? So through the metadata exchange, then the one side knows the other side is Istio sidecar, so they can do the Istio MTLS.
That is not how it works. You can't have a header decide to use MTLS because you have to decide to use MTLS before you send the header. It's based on the pod labels, not headers.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
I think
based on the pod label. Okay. Then then we don't need an extra header. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I want to make sure. Okay.
So does the metadata filter in our proxy actually have this information?
No, I think we'd have to add a way to selectively not add the header, which we just did for some other thing. So I don't think it's that hard, but we'd have to add it.
Can you give an example on what we just recently did? So if we were to implement this, we know what to follow. I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, there's this ALPN override thing. I'll send a link to you.
Okay, thank you.
But should I check with Huat as well? Because I think he had a proposal. Okay. Because that would make the whole discussion moot.
Oh, okay. I think I saw something you mentioned earlier.
So basically, Quat is proposing to replace the metadata exchange with the workload discovery service, and that will mean that will not have any telemetry in any case whatsoever. So the entire headers are gone.
That feels like something that's very long.
Yeah,
maybe.
I feel so too. Maybe that's only for ambient.
He is also proposing it for regular Istio because again, it's the same benefits that apply for ambient. But yeah, it may be a bit one or two releases more than this is a simple change.
Yeah, I would worry that may take a long time. Yeah. Okay, so I think we had some good discussion on the telemetry header. Well, folks approve lean towards option 2. We still need to drill into how to implement that, but the idea is relative. It's kind of depends on whether the target have the sidecar or not. Then we decide to send the metadata header. Do we care about if the target is in ambient or not? I guess we do.
In ambient, we don't want to set this header because we do it in baggage.
Oh, that's right. So
or
that's
assuming.
I'm sorry. What was that?
Or WDS quads.
Okay, so okay, so this is only for sidecar, which is cool, I think. Yeah, and then do we want to quickly discuss for other headers? What would be our preference for option 1 or 2 if somebody have bandwidth to implement that?
I think we had agreed on proxy config previously, and it was just a matter of the exact shape of the messages.
Okay, cool. I'm cool with that if there's no objection. Yeah.
I have updated the PR to what I thought was the suggestions the last time we discussed this. So please take a look, and maybe I didn't do what you wanted.
But John, in context of this discussion, is there any sense to send any metadata or headers that are not related with telemetry when the other side doesn't have sidecar and it's not part of the mesh? I mean,
I feel like this stuff is like not even related to whether it's in the mesh or not. It's just things that we shouldn't do, like set the server header to Envoy. Like, that doesn't matter if you're in the mesh or not. It's just wrong. And well,
I agree. I agree it's wrong everywhere, but like Kit was saying earlier, I mean, it's not something we document as part of the API. We should not make it part of the API if it's something where we can, if it's outside of the mesh, we don't interfere, we don't do anything, we don't touch anything. And if it's part of the mesh, it should not be visible to user. And you know,
well, these are all like, I don't know, out. I don't know why like we would send the Envoy, the server header, to something in the mesh, but not to something out of the mesh. It feels weird. Like, why does it matter in the mesh?
No, I'm saying outside of the mesh, clearly we should not interfere with the user. And if it's inside the mesh, it's internal implementation details that we should not necessarily expose the user to nodes for this. Anyway, I'm not against the proxy config. I think I proved it already. But we should maybe take the same approach, at least for non-mesh workloads.
Go ahead, Lei.
Yeah. So for other headers and also for telemetry header, isn't the logic that if the LPN is Istio, then we can exchange it. Oh, sorry, we can send these headers, right? So essentially, that means the channel will be MTLS and the other end is Istio, right? LPN equals Istio.
The other headers I don't think are in the same category. Like, for example, if you have a gateway, we expose server is Istio. What does that have to do with MTLS? There's no MTLS involved at all. Like, this is a gateway. We expose whether it was a retry or not. Like, these are things that I don't think we should put in the headers, but we already did. And so now we need a way to turn them off. But it has nothing to do with whether it's in the mesh or not, in my opinion. They're completely orthogonal from MTLS or mesh. It's just extra headers that we add. And maybe we shouldn't be adding them. Yeah. But the other ones is different because it's mesh internal data transmission, kind of. Like, it has one purpose, is to get information between two proxies. And it's already intended to be stripped before it gets to the application. So it's intended to be an internal thing. The other headers are not intended to be internal things. They're actually sent to the upstreams in all cases. So I feel like they're a fundamentally different case. Like the metadata one's just a bug that we don't strip in all the right cases. So.
Okay, are we good on this? If so, I would like to give mic back to John for your other topics. So thanks, everyone.
Okay.
All right, let's go complete backwards order because they'll be faster. We probably don't need to discuss too much. I just want to bring these up. So one thing going on in Kubernetes now is they added cell validation for CODs. Basically, instead of having a webhook, you put the cell logic inline in the CRD. They added this 1.23, so we can't use it yet, probably, or rather, not all users can use it yet. We can't require it yet, but it's pretty close. I was looking through all of our validations, and like 95% of the stuff I think works in cell. There's some other work going on to extend it, which will probably get us to 99. We do have some weird things like an Envoy filter. We fully try and do like the protobuf parsing and whatnot, the actual patch. I don't think that's something Cell will ever do, nor should it. So I don't know that we'll ever get to 100% parity, but we'll be very close. And we may consider something like the webhook's optional for like if you want extra validation and it's not even there by default or something potentially. So yeah, that's about it. I'm not proposing we do this yet, just that we should start looking into it, and I have started looking into it. So it's something that we should probably consider doing in the next year or so. Okay, cool. Next one. That was good, quick. This is somewhat related. So in Istio, we have every version of our CRDs is identical, if you're not familiar. And we have multiple versions of CRDs, which, again, are identical. So historically, we have just read the oldest CRD in Istio forever. So like we made virtual service beta like 2-3 years ago. We still read virtual service alpha. And it actually does not matter at all because it's the same thing. The question here is, should we be moving to read the new ones? The benefit is that if we don't do this, then we can never, ever remove the old versions. But at the same time, we have never removed the old versions. And if we remove the old versions, it kind of breaks canaries. So looking for opinions here. I think there's probably a lot of weird edge cases of what could go right or wrong doing this. So having more eyes on it would help. I'm not necessarily proposing we do it, but that people think about what goes wrong and right if we do this. Yeah, Costin.
Yeah, I mean, there is also gateway APIs coming and kind of the new ambient API. So maybe it's better to wait a bit until that settles down and just see if people move to the new API completely and we don't have to worry about it.
Well, we'll still read the old CRDs, but.
Well, if in 1 year people are using HTTP route and nobody's using virtual service, then there is no need to spend time worrying about it.
That's true. Okay, well, I encourage people to think about this and comment there. I think it's probably the type of thing you only come up with comments after thinking about it for a while. So we're on a roll, so let's go to the next one. All right, last one. So for some background, in Kubernetes, obviously, services are matched by cluster IP. And in Istio for HTTP, it's matched by host header, and we ignore the IP. In sidecars. In ambient, we follow the Kubernetes pattern and match on IP. And in gateway API for HTTP route, it is specified and tested in conformance tests that you should match on the IP as well. So there is an issue that we can't pass the gateway API mesh conformance test without matching on the IP. So today we failed the mesh conformance test that we wrote. So the question is, how do we fix this? I thought it was simple. But it turns out it's not simple. So here I am asking for advice. The simple fix I thought was, okay, if they create an HTTP route for a service and we add a listener that matches the IP and we just use that and everything's good to go. The problem is that if you already have opened a connection to the service and you've already selected a listener, and so you're already kind of on the old way. And so if we add a listener that now would have matched your traffic, it won't like somehow move your connection from the old listener to the new listener. So if we then remove the route from that listener, you'll suddenly start getting 404s indefinitely until you close the connection, which you maybe will never do and keep retrying. If we keep the route there, then like we could duplicate the same route, but it could get quite large between the two. And then it's kind of odd and wasteful, especially since it's kind of a weird edge case. Or we could do something like just keep the plain not HTTP route, like just the default match / and go to the service. But then it's weird that like part of your requests don't follow the route and part of them do, based on whether they're a new or old connection. So I didn't come up with any great ideas here. I feel like there's a few options. We could not pass conformance for sidecars. We would do it for ambient, but not for sidecars. Not great, but something we could do. We could move to matching IPs everywhere, which I think is correct. And I had a doc a while ago. It's linked there, the outbound traffic matching changes, about how and why we should do this, but we didn't do it because it's a breaking change. We could try and change Envoy or kind of work around it or something else. That's kind of option 3 through N. And Costin, can you explain the root problem? Where does gateway API match by IP? Yes, when you have a parent ref of service, the spec and conformance test say that this means that traffic that is destined to the cluster IP of the service should apply the route.
So in the gateway API or in Gamma API?
In the gateway API subsection that was specified by the Gamma group that specifies what it means to attach to a service.
Oh, so basically, if we attach by cluster front end, then it's not going to work. The ones that we're also discussing in sense of, okay, I see.
Yeah, if you attach to a service, what we've defined is that the service match is IP.
Yeah, I understand. I know what you're talking. So it's an attachment to service front end, and if we support it, then that's yes. And ambient is already doing the correct thing. So it's basically the issue is, can we break Istio? Probably not. but we can still do what you did for the other HTTP route, special behavior. I mean, if we know that user is using gateway Gamma API or gateway attachment to front-end service, then we can generate the config that is compatible with ambient and with the rest of the world.
Well, that's what I thought we could do, but the issue is that in Envoy, I don't see how we can do that without breaking traffic. Like, I don't see how you can have a live migration from having no route to having one route and have it work without doing terribly inefficient things.
I think we're worrying too much about live migrations and things like that. I mean, we can detect if user is using Gamma because they have at least one attached resource with Gamma, and then we follow that behavior. Or I don't know.
Yeah, but you don't want, once they apply their first HTTP route, they're greeted with a nice gift of their entire cluster getting 404s and breaking, right?
Well, ambient migration. Well, I don't know. Maybe we don't support Gamma in Istio Classic, so it's not a problem. We support it only ambient. I don't know.
Keith, do you have a question, or were you going to say what I said?
I was going to say what you said. That the issue is the first route application. I don't know. It's interesting problem here. It feels like cluster IP routing is the right thing to do. I don't know if that's contentious or not, just because I don't know the Istio history. I know that the project as a whole very much stays away from breaking changes. I guess I'm curious about, if we did want to make a breaking change, could we put the behavior behind a feature flag and then at some date in the future flip the feature flag? If aligning to Gamma or correct HTTP behavior, well, correct container networking behavior is our goal. Would that be an effective way to get there? I think it just depends on our tolerance for churn from a user perspective.
Yeah, the issue we've had with feature flags in the past is that if you make it off by default, no one uses it. And if you make it on by default, then it doesn't really matter that you put the feature flag because you broke all the users when they upgraded. It's hard to actually make the transition. Costin has an interesting point in the thread I'll read. What if we only support Gamma for ambient? It would be tricky if you have, like, we want to have sidecars and ambient together, which may make that hard. And we want to encourage Gamma, because Gamma is much better than virtual service. We could do it, but it may have some complications. We could make, instead of, like, we talked about all this stuff gated behind ambient, like as in the data plane, but we could actually make this ambient gate do a lot more than just control the data plane, potentially. Like, why not say that if you want ambient, you have to opt into whatever we decide that we don't like it, or that we like now, and change how sidecars work.
So what if they had a test? What if they had a test to verify service import works, and then to verify that if you have two clusters, and then it's really respect the semantics of cluster local, and so there are a lot of other things in Gamma that and in gateways that imply compatibility with Kubernetes that we kind of break in Istio with sidecars. And it's not only this thing. I mean, this thing may be feasible, but there are other kind of things that are not yet tested for.
That's true, but we also, it's not a black box that spits out tests that we have to pass or fail. Like, we are involved in the process, and for service import, for example, we specifically made it so that it wasn't required to follow it.
Sure, but
that's or not, that's a different question. But
of course, we can skip it, not write a test for things that are broken, are not conformal. The user expectation is that whatever is written in the spec and the behaviors of spec are correct.
It's not just the test that we don't do. We also make it so the spec is ambiguous or permissive, but I don't think it changes things that much.
Am I correct in thinking that the only issue, the reason this is difficult is because of the Istio default routing behavior when there are no route resources.
Yeah, if like the fix that would be ignoring backwards compatibility, what I would do is change that behavior to align with Kubernetes, which also aligns with Gamma and Ambient. And fix that external name thing while we're at it.
I'll let Ian go in a second. I think the flip side to think about here is if as the way we're going right now, sidecar Istio is only one out of the 3 that behave this way compared to Gamma, Ambient, and Kubernetes. So that's also a risk in the opposite direction, where sidecar Istio, looking at the long tail, will be completely out of step with the other 3 standards unless we fix the collision course. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so one of the things that John brought up was like, if they have existing connections that are still open, switching them over would be tough. If we somehow gated this not only around like having the Gamma API, but also around like a new sidecar got injected or whatever, when all of the connections are going to be fresh, would that resolve some of that? It might be tricky to do.
Kind of. I had considered similar, but the issue is, like, as a user, I apply a route, and then it does nothing, and that's weird.
Yeah, that's true.
Is there a way for us, this is just me spitballing this point, but is there a way for us to, Nick, this is a different direction. Would it be helpful if there was a metric that users could consume from the control plane to notify them of future breaking changes that were going to come down the pipe?
Future breaking changes. I mean, let's see. Yes, I mean, so we have one mechanism for this is Istio cuddle pre-check and analyze, which are kind of similar. I guess future we haven't done yet. We haven't said, hey, we're going to do this. Like we could have a warning that says, hey, in 2 releases, we're going to switch to this behavior. If you want to silence this warning, explicitly switch to it today. That'd be fine. I've also thought maybe we should probably have a metric for deprecated feature usage. So having a soon to be deprecated feature, or even just calling it deprecated and then clarifying what we mean in another doc, I think would be useful. So largely, I agree. If you look at my control plane observability doc, I've started very early started listing out some metrics I think we should add, and that's one of them. So I definitely agree.
But we also said that we are, for Istio 1.0 or whatever we call it with sidecars, we are not going to break compatibility, and we are prioritizing, consistency and stability and so forth. And all the breaking change will happen in ambient. So we don't want to have two tracks where we do backward incompatible changes and put users to hell when we already have ambient on the way, where a lot of things will change, a lot of APIs will change. So rather migrate to ambient instead of migrating from version to version and do this kind of painful thing in minor upgrades.
I think it's important to recognize that this would still be, if you didn't get breaking change, this is still a focus on stability and compatibility. Because if you, again, thinking about the long term, you've got Kubernetes and Ambient and Gamma as a spec behaving a certain way. Sidecar Istio will be the exception. So again, maybe it might not be today, and it might not be a timing thing, but I think it's useful to say we want to do this at some point. That's still a useful decision point if we are comfortable with that. So I think maybe maybe John, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe that's the question: is do you want to do this at all, and then we can decide what the proper time would be and how we can give users the best time to move over.
So if we decide not to do this for sidecar, we could potentially add it if a lot of people are asking, right? That's still an option, is that right?
We could, but if it's changing, if it is doing the fixing traffic matching, which is a breaking change, it's harder
Right.
later. Like at the time that I presented that doc, it was like, and we really don't want to make breaking changes. Let's not do it. But that was 18 months ago. If we had just done it then, we would be in a happy place right now and not have any of these issues.
Yeah.
It's
And
always
I've heard
easier.
I've heard people really like your doc, by the way. They were like, well, this is the right behavior. Yeah.
Well, that's actually, I think, the root cause of all of Istio issues is backwards compatibility. Like everything that's bad in Istio, we know about it. We just can't fix it. There's no unknown. There's no issues with Istio that the maintainers are not aware of, right?
So are we going to change cluster local semantics for sidecar based? Because that's another thing where clearly we violate.
That's also the thing. It's like a slippery slope. Like maybe we want V2. That's what I was saying is maybe ambient is not just a data plane. Maybe we also go fix all the stuff and we can use ambient as a carrot, and it's kind of a package deal. You fix everything, but it's tricky. Like if we just say, the change you talked about is important as well, but I think it's a bigger change. I'm not saying it's not as valid. I'm just saying like it's, we need to.
I don't know if you remember 01, Istio 01, 02, 03, where every minor release was some breaking change, a small one, but people had to do manual changes and test and pain and suffering. And we got a lot of, bad name for that period. So are we going to restart that? I mean, did we learn anything?
I don't know.
To be different this time.
It was a long time ago, so we forgot about the pain, right?
Okay. I mean,
I totally agree. Like it's very valid. It's just it's unfortunate.
So speaking of ambient, we are 2 minutes over, and it's eating into the ambient meeting time.
Let's move over. Sounds like we should all think on this and discuss again.
Yeah, sounds right.
See you all.
See ya.
See you in a bit.